Hey everybody, what's going on? I hope you're having a great day so far, and I'm happy to be back doing another episode talking about the Mastermind GT by RGM Music Technology. In this week's video, I want to go over the basic fundamentals of MIDI. Whether you're advanced with MIDI or you're just getting into it, this will be a great video that goes over the fundamentals from the smallest detail of what MIDI is, why we use it, how it's used, and just some of the general terminology and lingo regarding it. You may or may not have heard of things like program changes or CC toggles and notes like that, or maybe you've seen the MIDI in and out connectors on a device of any kind that has to do with gear. So we're going to go over all these things. And I wanted to make this video before we do any deep dives into any of the gear that associates with the GT, because I want everybody here to have a great understanding of how MIDI works. Not only that, but if you are someone who is making your own rig that involves MIDI for the first time, I want you to feel more confident in the fact that you have the knowledge of what all of this stuff means, and that you can now have a good foundation of something to refer to in an area that relates to what you do when you're designing a rig. When I first started out working with the Mastermind about 4 years ago, I was very primitive in knowledge when it came to MIDI. It was like trying to take a pre-calc exam. I was really bad at figuring this stuff out, but over time as I kept on doing projects with this thing, I got more confident because I was putting myself in a position to learn, and that's what I encourage you guys to do. My goal by the time you're done watching this video is to understand the general principles and knowledge of MIDI, but then what I want you to do is, if you have a Mastermind GT, keep working with it and get to know it. If you're someone who has various MIDI devices and you've never really tackled on how to make them compatible with each other in your rig, go ahead and give it a shot. There's always going to be points where we struggle, and maybe even worse, and I've experienced this, spending up to, what you think might be 2 hours trying to find the right YouTube video to make this stuff work, and then next thing you know it's turned into like 5 or 6 hours. It's the worst. Been there a bunch of times. But you're in the right place. Because I've experienced that, I'm going to make sure that you're walking away from this video with at least the fundamentals of how this stuff works. Because once you have an idea, you're going to have so much more confidence in making decisions on where to go next when things don't seem to be working. So let's begin this lesson from the origins of MIDI and where it all came from and how it got to where we are now. So back in the 1980s and prior to that, there were tons and tons of different synthesizers and music devices that had a certain kind of connector with it that would allow it to control other devices and give, special messages to have it work to whatever you needed. However, it got to a point where so many of these devices were being massively produced that it would result in people spending so much money just to buy the right type of cable and other devices in order for, devices from different brands to even work with each other. So by 1982, one of the business heads from Roland tried to implement an idea that would allow all devices to tie together with one type of code, and that is where MIDI comes from. Over years it has developed greatly and has drastically changed the way that we even approach producing music. Before the 1990s, there was no recording to the grid to a tight metronome click. MIDI changed all of that, and because of that, now we have great ways to run our effects rigs, and even just from songwriting by working with the grid. And what do I mean by the grid? So let's say that you're looking at a DAW like Pro Tools or Logic and you see where the bars or measures are. That's the grid, the number of bars that you're at. The way that you count the upbeats and downbeats to get to each measure on end. And you might think, why am I mentioning this now? Well, if you're someone who wants to run automation with the Mastermind, that's very important to know. Because I know that a lot of you watching this video would probably like to learn how to externally control your GT so that you don't even have to touch the buttons when you're playing certain songs live. And that is something that took me a while to master, but I got there. So I hope that I can help you get there too. Okay, so now that we've gotten the history lesson out of the way, let's talk MIDI here. So MIDI is an acronym, and it stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. And what MIDI is meant to do is controlling one device from another. Let's say, for example, you're a piano player, and you like a certain piano's tones and presets that it has, but you may not necessarily like the way it feels. So you buy a keyboard MIDI controller that you can connect to by MIDI, and what you can do is send MIDI commands to that piano that's hooked up to the cables to your sound system, and now you can perform with that keyboard. That is one example that we might use MIDI for. In another sense, the Mastermind GT. We may like how all of these effects sound, but we may not like the way they're controlled. Like with an Axe Effects, you can't change scenes and presets by just dialing while you're playing. So Fractal Audio might design their own remote control, just like how Kemper would. But maybe you want more than that. Perhaps you would like to control different pedals and a looper. So we have the Mastermind GT so that we may send MIDI commands to all of these things. And it works by using special different types of codes, ranging from program changes, PCs, and you might also see what's called a continuous control, CC messages. There are various types of different CC codes like toggles, momentaries, and then there's other instances where you might see MIDI velocity. We're going to get into all these things in a bit. Now, the way that we connect all of our MIDI devices, we have a few options. This is a standard MIDI cable. If you have a look inside of the connector, you'll count 5 pins. Most devices will come with 5-pin connectors by default. However, in the case of the Mastermind especially, you might see another type of MIDI cable that actually has 7 pins. And that's very common when it comes to using that cable to power a device. For example, the Mastermind GT has a 7-pin MIDI connector on its MIDI Out, so that you may phantom power the Mastermind with, let's say, an Axe Effects or a Kemper. And this device right here, which is my pedal looper, it is powered by a plug-in adapter, but it doesn't connect with some kind of volt input. It works with a MIDI cable that has 7 pins. So with the Mastermind, we can power this thing and still send data through that same 7-pin MIDI cable. You can send that 7-pin cable to an RJM Phantom power box, and then from there, you'll have 2 additional connectors. One will be for an AC adapter that can plug into your power conditioner in your rack, and then from there, you can finally send that cable to the rest of your MIDI chain. Another type of cable used for MIDI, which is very, very common, is a USB cable. You'll have 2 types of connectors, your Type A, which will usually connect to a computer, and then the Type B, which will go to your device. I like to call these MIDI to USB cables, because that's essentially what they're doing. They are sending the same type of MIDI data, only it's going to a different type of device, a computer, so that you may work with the computer in MIDI, especially in the case of a DAW, and you can still send and receive commands. And then lastly, this is not as commonly used, but I definitely have a place for it in my effect rig. We have an actual USB to MIDI interface. This is designed by a company called Mio. We have several connectors on here. We have a MIDI in and an out connector, which sends the data to the base here and then turns it into USB signal to go to your computer. There are many instances and possibilities of why we'd want to use that kind of cable, and I'm excited to show you more of what that'll be like in future videos. So let's go ahead and go over how MIDI devices connect to each other. So on any given MIDI devices, you'll commonly see 2 different types of connectors, a MIDI in and a MIDI out. And then in many cases, you'll see a third one called a MIDI through. So the job of a MIDI out connector is when you hook it up to the device, it is sending the outgoing data. In other words, when we connect a Mastermind to a device, we hook it up to the MIDI out on the back of the GT because we are sending MIDI commands out to another device. And then, on the other side, this is where MIDI in comes to play. The MIDI in connector will then receive the commands that come in from another device. So let's say that we were controlling Axe Effects 3 right now. We would hook up the MIDI out on the GT to the Axe Effects 3's MIDI in. And now we are able to command which presets and scenes we'd like to call up in Axe Effects. Now, as for the MIDI through, So what happens is, say that we want to command another device like our pedal looper right here. So since we're already connected from the MIDI out of the GT to the in of the Axe effects, there's really nowhere else for the signal to go if we use the MIDI out on the Axe effects. And the reason why is because Axe Effects 3 is not necessarily a MIDI controller. I mean, yes, of course, it absolutely can send other MIDI data to, something like a DAW or work with bidirectional data between other devices. However, what it cannot do is send commands to control another device with guaranteed results. So this is where MIDI through comes into play. A MIDI through connector allows us to connect a MIDI controller from one device's MIDI in, and then if we want to set up a chain of different MIDI devices, we can use the MIDI through to continue sending that MIDI out signal to make it to other devices down along the way. Like in our example with the relationship between the Mastermind and the Axe effects, we would plug in from the MIDI out of the GT, the MIDI in of the Axe Effects 3, and then if we want to control anything else afterwards, we will connect to the MIDI through, and then we can go to town from there with many other MIDI devices. Now sometimes there is a catch to this. Certain devices like the whammy pedal from Digitech, they won't even have a MIDI out connector. That just has a MIDI in so that it can receive commands. So what do we do there? Well, you have a couple of choices. A device like that could be the very, very last thing in your MIDI chain, or there's another solution that makes you have to do way less thinking and planning. We have devices such as the T8 Output MIDI Through Box by MIDI Solutions. And what exactly this thing does is, it splits the signal with all these MIDI outputs, and they all connect to one single MIDI in that is also on the back of the device. So once you plug in all the MIDI devices you like to control, you may connect the MIDI in of the T8 to a MIDI out port on a MIDI controller like the Mastermind GT. All you have to do is establish which channel each device is working with, which is the perfect segue to the next part of this video. MIDI channels. Let's talk about that. A MIDI channel is defined by numbers, and each number is a designation of what channel that one or more MIDI devices will use to communicate with each other. For example, let's say that we have Axe Effects 3, and we want it to be commanded by the Mastermind GT. We need to know which MIDI channel it's on in order for it to work. So for example, real quick, we can go into the Setup menu, and I will go to its MIDI settings, hit enter, and I'll see that we have the MIDI channel on 3. The next thing we do is head to the main menu of the Mastermind GT, and then we would want to hit Edit Devices to register it as a MIDI device within the GT. As you can see, it's already here as Axe Effects 3, and we have the MIDI channel indicated right here that it's at number 3. So right now, the Mastermind GT and Axe Effects 3 are in a state where they can communicate with each other. We can use the GT to send commands for different preset and scene functions, and so much more. Every MIDI device, even if it's just some kind of pedal without a screen, has the ability to have a MIDI menu where you can select different devices. Every MIDI device out there has the ability to let you know which MIDI channel it's functioning on, as well as being able to change it. For any device that you're working with, just go ahead and refer to the owner's manual that it came with, or you can always Google it. And at the end of every manual, you'll often see what's called a MIDI implementation chart, as well as instructions on how to access the MIDI setup menu within that device. Even if it's something like a whammy pedal or even this looper right here that doesn't have a display screen, there are ways to reach that MIDI menu. So all you have to do is just take a minute at most to see how you can change that MIDI channel if needed, and then before you know it, you'll be able to rock with your device and send commands at will. Speaking of commands, let's go over what types of MIDI commands exist. So we have PCs, which stands for program change, and then CC, which is continuous control. Program changes associate with presets on a device. Let's say, for example, we're working with the whammy pedal, right? And we have different presets within it, and we would like to use a MIDI controller to access which preset. You'll be sending a program change message in order to make that happen. Now, in the case of continuous control, this will always associate with certain types of functions that a device can do. For example, on the whammy pedal, the pitch shifter expression pedal, we're able to command its behavior and activity by using a CC toggle message. And you can do that remotely by using an expression pedal tied in with your MIDI controller. Now, it's one thing to have the CC toggle message in order to command when you're going to be using the shifter, but how exactly are we telling it to move? Well, there's another thing called MIDI velocity. MIDI velocity is measured on the numbers 0 to 127, being their minimum and maximum numbers of velocity, respectively. So let's say that, and I'm just making up a number for the sake of the conversation, let's say that in order to work the pitch shifter on a whammy pedal, we need CC code number 11. Alright, great. So what we would do is we would punch in CC number 11 in the menu of the GT for the expression pedal that we're working with. But however, the way that the pitch shifter knows where it's supposed to be at any given moment you use an expression pedal is by using the MIDI velocity numbers. So let's say that we are in the downward position of the pedal from minimum, you would be at 0. Or if you are in the position of the toe at the top, you'll be up to 127. This is something that's usually more visually accessible when you're working with a DAW. Let's say that you were in Pro Tools or Studio One and you wanted to use automation on this. That's where you would actually see these numbers being used. Or perhaps you would just like to engage the button of the whammy pedal to actually turn on. If we set the minimum to 0, that would be the off position of the pedal. But then if you want to activate it, you can put that up to number 127 and that would engage the pedal. So at this point, we've gone over how MIDI devices communicate with each other with the means of certain cables, channels, their signal flow from one device to another, as well as what types of commands there are. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and take a closer look at the Mastermind by accessing RJM's application called the Mastermind GT Editor. It's a free application that you can download on rjmmusic.com, and once you fire it up, you can connect your Mastermind GT with the USB cable and you'll actually have access to the same exact system settings that are on board the GT from a more visually pleasing platform from your computer. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. So here's the starting page of the app. This tab represents all of your primary global settings in the Mastermind. You can expect to see settings here along the lines of how many pages might be within a preset, or how MIDI is sending data back and forth to each other, what mode it might be in, its receive channel, and so much more. If we head over to the Devices tab, this is where we can establish connections between the external devices that we're sending MIDI commands to. And as you can see, I have up to 10 different devices registered in the GT. You can have a maximum of 16 devices working with it. And within each device, you have access to all of its settings, such as the MIDI channel that you'd like the Mastermind to work with it on. You can name the device, select which port that you'd like it to communicate with, whether it be MIDI in, out, or USB. That all just depends on exactly what you're using. And you can control how it sends or receives certain MIDI data. The next tab over is your buttons. This is where you can go ahead and program all the buttons that you use in every preset or page that you use in the Mastermind. We have different buttons like presets, instant access, and they can perform a whole different wide array of actions. For example, if we look at one of these red buttons right here, this is for a whammy pedal preset that does the up and down octave pitch harmony. In each button settings menu, we have the ability to determine what mode the button is in, the type of button we have, and that can not only range from presets or instant access, but you can also decide whether or not it's going to be for a song or setlist menu, bank up or down, page up or down, or many other special Mastermind functions that are within the system. We can assign our buttons to different groups. Perhaps if there's a few buttons that are relative to each other that control a certain device, but we might only want to use one at a time, we can put them in a group, so that way once you select one button within a group after using another, it'll deactivate that other channel and you can then use whatever's in that button. And then of course you can name the button, give it its on and off colors, and then finally you can assign its actions. So right now this button is assigned the action of opening up a channel in the pedal looper so that we can engage the whammy pedal and then simultaneously access the preset that we want to call up. So let's go ahead and back out of this, and let's head over to the Presets tab. So this is where we can access the whole list of presets that are within the device, and you may tweak the settings of every preset that's here, and that can cover the tempo of the preset, what types of commands or presets that you'd like to send to your other devices, and you can even add what's called a local page, which gives you the ability of assigning specific buttons meant for that preset. In other words, when you create a page of buttons with the Mastermind GT, these buttons will be in every single preset. However, if you want something very specific to be done in one song, but not have it applied to all of your general page settings throughout the device, you can select any of these presets and you can add buttons that have exclusive functions required for that song that you'd like it to do. Awesome stuff. Building up from presets, we can eventually turn them into songs. Let's head to the Songs tab. So let's say that you're playing a song, but you'd like to have access to multiple different presets for it. So what we can do is, we can create songs in the Mastermind, give them a name, and then on the right hand side here, these are all of the available presets within the GT that are loaded in from our external devices. We can fly them into the section right here called Presets in the Song. So for example, Fever Dream by Quiet, I have a Crystal Echoes preset that does some really cool sounds, and then another preset for the actual song, Fever Dream. So when I'm on my pages menu for the Mastermind, I'm able to call both of these up with great ease. I don't have to worry about flicking back and forth between, tons of other pages by the time I want to get to the preset that I need. And then finally, we can group all these songs into a set list. So if we head to this tab here, you can see that I have many different set lists for shows that Quiet might be performing, or I cover a lot of bands, so I like to put them in categories. The only other two tabs left in the GT are for SysX and Macro. That's an area that I'm not really well versed in or educated on because I never really have to work with those. So if you have any questions about stuff like that, I would recommend checking out the RGM forum on their website. Just go ahead on it and create an account if you haven't already, and you can start threads and ask questions on the masterminds for whatever you need help with. Someone will always answer back very, very quickly, whether it be Ron Manelli or anyone else within the RGM community. So I definitely encourage you to go check that out. Otherwise, that's the Mastermind Edit app for you. Alright everybody, we're going to wrap it up with today's video now. I hope that you learned a thing or two by watching this video, and I thank you for being here. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to leave a comment and I'll help out in any way I can. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel to keep up to date with upcoming videos. Starting next week, we'll be taking a closer look at how we can really use the GT with other external devices. I'm very excited to show you guys all of these videos and going over the many things that we can do with the Mastermind GT. So on that note, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next week.